Hello, and welcome to Lady Jane Books. Today, I have an incredibly exciting live show. Today, we are having the fantastic Laurel Hightower, author of the book Crossroads. We also have my dear booktube buddy, Steve talks about books and stuff. Steve and I actually did a buddy read of Crossroads by Laurel Hightower, and today we're going to talk about it. So, welcome both of you to Lady Jane Books. I'm so excited to have you as my first guest on my channel.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is great.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for hosting, and thanks, Laurel, for coming by and chatting with us about Crossroads.
Absolutely happy to. Thank you all for buddy reading it. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, do you want to start by just kind of introducing yourself, Laurel, about what type of books you write and how you came up with the idea of Crossroads?
Sure, yeah. So my name is Laurel Hightower. I write horror. Prior to Crossroads, I published my debut novel, Whispers in the Dark, which is it's very different from Crossroads. It's a lot more action packed. Snipers and things like that going on. And I've had some short stories published, and I co-edited the charity anthology "Where Are Wolves" last year with Gemma Amora and Sina Paleo. Um, Crossroads came about. It was one of those things that just came about really quickly. We drove the Bluegrass Parkway is between where I live and where my sister lives, and we take that trip quite a bit. And I just saw. I used to, and I'm, still do see all those crosses by the side of the road. And I kind of thought about, why they're there, like whether it reminds people in a bad way or a good way, or, what it would feel like to see that every time I drove that if it was someone that I loved. And the story just kind of came from there, about whether just kind of thinking about whether you'd visit it and why. And my son and I do a lot of cemetery visits. So, we kind of think about that too, who is at the place that you're visiting, whether they are or not. And, writing about loss of a child is not something I ever planned to do because it's one of those things I figured that it would be just kind of too hard to deal with. And kind of, I'm a little bit superstitious, so I don't want to say its name really. So, but it was just a story that took hold in my head and came really quickly. And yeah, it definitely didn't wrestle with me the way that all my novels wrestle with me. So I'm starting to think maybe novella is a really useful format for not taking 9 years to put out a book. So
That's very cool. So when you write, what's your writing style? Do you just kind of get an idea and then throw it onto the page, or are you very methodical and do the timelines, or how do you create a story like this?
in particular, with the length of that, I do not always outline a short story. Short stories, the ones that are easy for me are the ones that sort of download almost, fully formed, and I'm like, ooh, okay, yeah, but they're more of a snapshot kind of a thing. There's not really any character development or anything. I'm a big fan of outlines. I do commonly one that looks a lot like it'll be just a very skeletal kind of scene plan once I've gotten some thoughts out on the page on my characters and what I want to happen to them, what the theme of it is. And then as I go, I do what I call a call and answer. If I don't know if you've ever beta read for somebody or even just read a story that you thought, man, that's just not quite complete. I would like to ask, well, what happened to this, or why would he do this? Those are the questions I ask myself as I'm reading so that hopefully no one else later says, what the hell, Hightower, So I really like that part of it because it allows it keeps the conversation going within my own head and within the story. So yeah, I'm definitely more methodical when it comes to that. And characters are the most important part for me. It's what I like to read. It's what I like to write. I like to be pulled in by a character. And so it's important for me to get the character right, for their actions to seem authentic. And so what I will usually do with a longer piece of fiction is as I'm in the planning stages and in the, writing a few awesome scenes that I kind of have in my head already kind of thing, getting excited about it, I carry around a notebook and I'll kind of think about my character and what their background is. And I'll be in a situation and be like, okay, well, I react this way because this is my background, but how would Chris react? How would Rose react? And I really like that time to kind of get in their heads and build out a fleshier backstory that nobody but me is ever going to read, but that that helps me refer back to when I'm putting them on the page.
Excellent. Okay, so I think we're about ready to. I think everybody that's viewing has arrived. I would like to kind of jump in and do a non-spoilery discussion first, and then
Yeah.
later on in the discussion, we'll talk all the spoilers.
Okay.
I do want to give a bit of a trigger warning to my audience out of respect for them. This is not a light read by any means. As Laurel mentioned, it does deal with a loss of a child. There's trigger warnings for self-harm, thoughts of suicide, and other more sensitive issues. So if that does bother you or you're uncomfortable with it, feel free to exit out of this video at any time.
Yeah, good opportunity to say reading is supposed to be fun. So if any of that sounds not fun, you don't have to read it. Even if you've bought it, throw it across the room. Enjoy reading. Don't suffer. Sorry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I just wanted to get that out of the way first. So Steve and I read this, and we read it as a buddy read for August. And I have some thoughts, but first I want to hear what Steve thinks. Steve, you have the floor.
Well, I wasn't sure what to expect with this one. I'd heard a lot of great things about it, but it's only 110 pages, but there's a lot in this book, and it really got to me in a good way. But it really made me think about parenthood and about loss and grief. And I'm not sure. I know it's must be really difficult to convey loss and depression and those really heavy feelings, especially the loss of a child, in text. And I don't know how it's done. I just know it was done right in this one, because it you really feel the weight of it when you're reading it. You really feel the grief and the trauma and the just that heavy, really heavy feelings on you while you're reading it. So I'm not sure how you did it, but great job with conveying that feeling
Thank you.
of darkness. And there's a ton here that I want to chat with you about. It's more on the spoiler side, but really made me think about parenthood and about life and generations. And I'm not sure, maybe I'm looking too much into it, but it really got to me and really made me think and see things differently than I did before.
Thank you. I love to hear that. And just based on what you're saying, I don't think you were, reading too much into it. There's there's a lot that goes into Chris and who she is and why she makes the exact decisions that she does. So yeah, I'm glad that came across. Thank you.
Definitely.
For me, what I really enjoyed about this book was that it was so layered. And Steve mentioned that, he got a lot of discussion about grief and loss out of it. I really got a lot of coping mechanisms out of it, like how different people cope under stress and how people cope
Yeah.
with that type of emotion, along with all of the grief. There were so many themes in this. I don't know how you packed all of this into about 100 pages. Every single page and every single sentence held a lot of weight to it. There really wasn't anything, kind of frivolous in my mind. But I also really, really appreciated the writing style in this. It was very stark in some ways. Like there wasn't a lot of flowy language. It was very like cut to the chase on, what was happening to Chris. And to me, it almost I almost pictured it like a screenplay in some ways. Like I could see every single scene and it was just a constant roll of images for me. So that's what I really liked particularly about this book. I do want to kind of give just an overview for people if they haven't read it. This book is about a woman named Chris who about a year ago lost her son in a devastating car accident. And a year later, Chris is still mourning the loss of that mourning the loss of her son. And there does seem to be some supernatural elements, and she's so in grief. She is so indebted to her grief that things take a very sinister turn. So that's the basic plot of this story. If it's something you're interested in, I highly recommend picking it up. But I think I want to hear about your thoughts on the generational parts of it.
We're
You
gonna
mentioned
get
that.
into Yeah, are we gonna get into spoilers? 'Cause I don't want
I think, yes, sorry.
to. Okay,
Yes, of course, I
I
apologize.
just want to
Yes,
be sure.
we are getting into spoilers now. If you do not want to be spoiled, or if you would like to leave this stream for any reason, feel free to do so. We are going to take about 5 seconds for you to make an exit, and we thank you very much for viewing today. So we are now starting the spoilers.
So, well, just really quickly, Jane, what you had mentioned before is there is no fat. There, I see, my all of my English teaches you there's too much fat on the bone when you're writing, and there's all this unnecessary stuff. There is nothing there was no wasted words or anything in this book. It is from start to finish. It flows. There's nothing extra that I was kind of like, well, okay, well, where is this going? It was always constantly moving, and always the story was always progressing. So with there's a lot to unpack here, but with the what really struck me is the lengths that Chris is willing to go just for a chance to hold her son again. So her hurting herself and mutilating herself and cutting pieces of her body off struck me as with parenthood we sacrifice things on our own. We sacrifice our own wants and our own needs, and we're not mutilating ourselves physically, but we make these sacrifices in a loving way for our children to see them succeed and to have a better life. So we do these things willingly and out of love to help them become better people than we were, and to become be successful and everything. So the fact that she was willing to go through these lengths just to hold her son for a few minutes, just to give him the chance to come back, and she was willing to trade places with him. That's almost and the fact that her mother, Chris's mother, wasn't as loving and as caring, as nurturing as she was, and Chris realized that she was a different kind of parent than her mother was. So the fact that she recognized that and changed the things that she knew growing up, and the way she was raised, and she changed that to be, because Chris, just to conceive, sacrificed a lot, mentally and physically and financially, just for the chance to conceive. So she went through all these things just for a chance to have her own child. And I think she broke that cycle or she was trying to break the cycle of that type of parenting that her mother had shown her, and that, she had grown up to be, Chris grew up to be better, and not to the world, but to her own mother, because she realized the way that she was brought up and the way that her mother didn't nurture her, that she nurtured her son. So her breaking that cycle was a big a big takeaway for me from the story, that she was willing to go through all these lengths to do for her son. She went above him, the things that she was willing to do, and her mother wasn't willing to do a quarter of what she was willing, but she recognized it. So breaking that cycle was a big takeaway for me. Sorry, I don't mean to talk to that. There's so much I want to talk about with this book, but
Well, that's the whole point of a stream, that you can talk about it. So don't apologize.
I don't want to hog the time or anything. But.
No, of course not. So building off of that, that's also something I noticed too. But for me, it was almost like the two extremes. Like you had Laurel's mom, who was like, you have to be, thankful for everything, and I'm the one that like put you here and all this stuff. And then you have Chris, who's literally giving up pieces of herself to a point where she no longer exists for her son. And that spoke volumes for me, because I do have a very different perspective than Steve does. We come from different backgrounds and different situations in life. But for me, it was almost like you have to find a middle ground. Like, don't be the type that is going to beat your child down, but also don't give up something so much that you're losing yourself in the process. That was kind of the most frustrating part of this book for me, because I'm a person that love means boundaries sometimes. So I could sometimes relate with the mother, where, she probably wasn't the type to let Chris go out at midnight. You know what I mean? Like, you can see where she drew some pretty healthy boundaries. But at the same time, Chris having this all-consuming love for Trey, her son, it didn't sometimes seem healthy to me too. So it was kind of like this battle of neither one is the perfect parent, not that there is such a thing, but it was so stark for me that you need something in the middle at some point. So I thought that was really interesting that you brought the mother into the grandmother. I call her
Yeah.
um, the grandmother into the story, because then it kind of personified why Chris was doing what she was doing. And that was the frustrating part, because I was like, why are you doing this? You don't have to be like, this road is not going to end well for you, Chris. You have to like draw the line at some point. But then once I met the grandma, I was like, that's why. Okay, I get it now.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a big thing with it is that Chris is you have different people who are involved in Trey's life who are grieving him in different ways.
Yeah.
And Lenore's is not healthy because it's still wrapped up in herself. It is the view of her as a grieving grandmother and how that, keeps the spotlight on her. Um, and you have Bo, who actually is probably grieving the healthiest out of the adults who are involved here, and in some ways to Chris, it might seem a little heartless, or she just doesn't understand how a person could move on. But the point is not moving on. It's continuing to live. And Bo has done
Right.
that
Yeah.
successfully. You know, certainly more so than Chris has. So yeah, I mean, I think it's important to take away from it that Chris is not exemplifying perfect parenthood. She's not exemplifying, what anyone should strive to be. But she's programmed to do that.
Yeah.
Because of her mother, because of how she was raised, a lot of people, when they're not happy with their childhood, they want to swing the pendulum the complete opposite way. I want to do everything my parents didn't do, and I want to not do all the things that they did. And there's with her, what I felt like was kind of for me most frightening about it in the situation she found herself in was her lucidity.
Yeah.
And that is something that, I mean, I people always kind of wonder whether they're characters you write or yourself, and the answer is yes and no. She's not me, but I have to be part her for me to be able to, to convey things. And that's something that I really understand. It's always interesting to me to read, really well done stories that deal with like kind of a descent into madness or those sorts of things, because it's not something. It's frightening to me, but it's also not something that I don't think I could do that accurately, because I'm almost obnoxiously lucid, like at all times. So, I could look at something and be like, wow, I would really like to descend into madness at this moment. Reality seems terrible. I'd like to go descend into this. And it's not. So I can see myself being like, yeah, I mean, look, the idea of cutting off my own thumb is clearly a poor idea on any level. I can't imagine why anyone would do it. And yet I can really connect the dots here and I can see why,
Yeah.
it's creepy. So that part was what was creepy to me, and adding that lucidity to it was what made it, real to me, was like, hey, this is not something that, that necessarily anyone in her life is going to look at and say, whoa, she's really, she's not with it. It's what puts her at greater danger, though. That exact lucidity, that ability to reason through it, that ability to be convincing to the people around her. It's all a perfect storm to completely, bring her down the path that she ends up on.
That's actually another point that I really enjoyed, is that obviously we're in Chris's perspective, but looking at it objectively, she had so much support around her. She had her boyfriend, Dan, she had the ex-husband, Bo, she had her mother, even though that's kind of useless, but okay. She had the people around her, and yet she still suffered so much on her own, even though she had like a support system. That was an incredibly powerful thing for me, because it really personified exactly how lonely and how deep into her despair she was, that even if the resources were right there, she couldn't bring herself to ask for help when she needed things, before things got really bad. So I thought that was a very poignant part of the book, and I thought it was really well done, and it was something to
Thank you.
worth exploring.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I
And
also
yeah.
Oh, sorry,
No,
Steve,
I'm
go
sorry. Go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No,
go
you're
ahead.
the guest, you go right ahead.
No, I was just going to mention with another thing that struck me in the story was the grief that she was, and the fact that she was grieving, and was almost like she was being taken advantage of, and it wasn't only people. It wasn't only this force or this just people in general. The way that they prey on other people who are in the grieving process, that really struck me too. Is how these people just get preyed upon by so people who are they can take they see those situations as a chance for them to um, as a chance to pounce and just take advantage of people who are in that kind of state of mind. So that was, and that's even a little bit more frightening is the fact that
Yeah.
people are willing to do that to each other, and knowing what they've been through. That's just awful. But
Yeah.
That you brought up you're reading my mind, Steve. Stop
oh,
it. That was my next point. So another point that I obviously got different things than Steve did out of this book. But one of the main things was that there was almost this undertone of abuse for me from the entity, because when I was looking at Trey and at their final like interaction where Trey's like, you need to make the ultimate sacrifice, you need to do it, you need to hurry, that to me, when you look at it objectively and when you forget that it's Trey or her perception of Trey, and you look at the wording, it's very manipulative and very abusive in some cases. So
Yeah.
I was, and to me, that kind of spoke on sometimes like victims of like domestic abuse where they're so in love and they're so infatuated that they can't see the other person bringing them down to like the worst level that another person can possibly do. That was the turning point for me in this book. That was where I was like, I have to stop reading because that was very emotionally hard for me to read. I don't know if you did that on purpose or not. I wasn't sure because this is a book about grief, but I kind of got that sense where it was almost like healthy love has boundaries in some cases. And the only way I can describe it was that that adage saying, well, if you love me, you would do this. And
Hmm.
then the person turns around and says, well, if you love me, you wouldn't ask me to. That's the
Yeah.
only thing that like rang so clear in my mind with that
Yeah.
interaction. So I don't know if that was purposeful. I don't know if that's just something I picked up on, but it was a really powerful moment for me in the book.
It was, and I really love doing this stuff because I like to hear how people interpret certain things and how it strikes them, because I can have an idea of how I want to convey something, but it's interesting because it can go all these other places and have all these other meanings. I didn't think about it specifically in terms of that kind of setting, but you're right. It is very applicable. It's exactly that kind of thing. And one of the things that because you're writing the story, you have to answer the question. It's like with the haunted house. Why do
Yeah,
they stay in the house? You have to answer that
yeah,
question. Why does she continue, when obviously there's something wrong and she knows it herself? She can feel it, but to admit that and to question it and go further in it means that she loses what she's got. And she's not willing
yeah,
to do that.
yeah,
And yeah, the manipulation aspect of it is intentional, and particularly you start with, because that's the thing with people who manipulate and abuse and harass and things like that, is that they don't ever start out strong like that. They show up and they smile and they're easygoing, and it's everything you ever wanted in that moment, and it's fantastic. And it's only later that things start to, you get asked to do a little bit more. And the idea of the haste of it, of the you have to
yeah.
hurry,
The hurry word, that's
Mhm.
what got me. I was like, nope, I have to step away from this for a minute. The hurry,
Yeah.
that bothered me a lot.
And that is a big tool of manipulators, because if you have time to sit and think about things, if you have
Yeah,
time to consult with somebody else, if you know yourself to be biased, then you're going to have a better opportunity to step away from something. But if you're being told, you have to hurry, there's a time frame on this. And then, another aspect that I included, because where he says, "Don't you know your own son?" When for a minute she
yeah,
wonders, like, "Is this
yeah.
you?"
It's like
Um,
gaslighting.
It is,
Yeah,
and it was, so there was this, I don't know if this has happened to anyone, but just, FYI, there is a scam that happens, where someone will call, they'll know enough information to be able to convince the person. They usually target elderly people. So my in-laws, who were in their mid 80s at the time, a few years before I wrote this, would get, I have a stepson too, 26-year-old stepson, wonderful, wonderful. And he's got a cousin who's close to his age. And at the time that they were making these calls, it was believable these boys might be somewhere doing something they shouldn't do. So my mother-in-law gets a call, or my father, I forget. Anyways, they get a call, and it's like, oh, this is Taylor. I'm in trouble. I'm in
Yeah.
Jamaica, and I've smuggled drugs. Just something. And it's like, and the caller said, like, I don't want you, I didn't want to call mom because it's her birthday. So he's got just enough information to be
Mm.
like, oh, well, and she even said, she was like, are you, this doesn't sound like you, Taylor. And the caller said, don't you know your own grandson? And that's what tipped it for her.
Hmm.
And
Oh.
I just thought that was so effective. It's because it's that guilt thing. It's the not only am I calling
Why
you for
would you
help, but
question me?
you
Yeah.
don't recognize my voice. What kind of a grandparent are you? What kind of a mother are you? If you don't recognize that kind of a thing. It was such an effective manipulation. So yeah, when I was writing this, I was like, yeah, that's,
Yeah.
something to throw in there.
That did actually happen to a friend of mine as well,
Did
and
it?
they called twice. Thankfully she stopped for a moment and she thought about it, and she's like, wait a minute, I just saw her this morning. Why would this happen? So thankfully everything was okay. But you're right. People can kind of, I think it's that surprise element too.
Hmm.
But I think for Chris, it wasn't necessarily surprise, but it was her grief mixed in with the expectation of never seeing her son again. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that to her would have been the surprise element. So I thought that was very interesting that you weave that into. I like that story. That's interesting, Laurel.
Hmm.
Thanks. Yeah. I hate that it happened.
Yeah.
The first time it happened, they actually did wire the money, but my
Uh,
husband is, he was on it, and he went and he stopped the wire, so nothing happened, but
good.
it was a big conversation we had within the family,
Yeah.
so that the next couple times they called, it was click. But yeah,
Yeah.
just to anybody who needs to know that is a scam, be very aware. In my family of origin, we have a code word that we've had since we were kids,
Hmm.
that if you need to convey that you're in trouble, or if you need to prove that you're who you are on the phone, we still have, we have that. It's probably really hyper vigilant, but I kind of recommend it for situations like that.
Not hyper
Sure.
vigilant whatsoever. You have to be careful this day and age. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, so I actually did want to talk a little bit more about like the supernatural elements in this
Hmm.
book. I think they were done in a very interesting way, that it wasn't necessarily like a spooky book, but it was just enough that it weaved in well with the realistic parts of the other book. I'm going to be totally honest. When I read the um, blurb for this, I was so afraid that it was kind of going to be a little bit like a Pet Cemetery retelling, but I was
It does
so
sound like it, doesn't
it
it?
does. Like when you read the blurb, it does, but it was so unique. It really wasn't. It was really its own entity and its own story. Um, and I think what was really important to that was the supernatural element. Um, so how did you come up with that? Like, obviously, Chris is a fan of the horror genre. She's kind of like likes these paranormal shows, but was that intentional that you needed like this other entity in order to get her to do what she was doing, or does it serve another purpose? Because it's very subtle. It's not the be all end all of this book, in other words.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, like, so I've often said that I am extremely literal minded. When you've got like little kids and they don't get um subtext at all or anything, like I never really grew out of that. I'm still just like, I'm sorry, explain yourself. No, I don't understand, And ambiguous horror used to drive me nuts. I'm like,
Yeah.
is there an alien or is there not? You can't leave me here. But the more I started reading, the more I got into realizing how effective it could be.
Yeah.
That and Paul Tremblay, of course, is just the absolute master of the ambiguous horror. And I know it drives people crazy. Sometimes it's funny to read reviews of his stuff because they're like, "But they never answered the question." It's like, exactly, really frustrating, isn't it? But still. So with this, the way that this story fell, I did not know exactly how it was going to end until I got there. But I had a clear idea, and I knew that there was something supernatural going on because the kind of the fact of the matter is, you start with a visitation of a ghost, right? And that can happen at any in any story at any time. There can be a number of reasons to have that visitation, but for something to ask you for sacrifices of that nature, of for a chance of actually like them living again, to me, there's no question that it couldn't possibly be her son, right? Because
Right.
she has screwed some things up as a parent in the sense that, as you mentioned, which I think is wise, love is about boundaries. That's healthy love. And even, Steve, as you mentioned, like you sacrifice for your kids, you sacrifice all the time. It is a fine line to walk to figure out what is the correct sacrifice, right?
Mm.
Because there's giving up what your interests and your needs to put theirs first, which I think is paramount. But you can't do that to your own detriment,
Yeah.
and not just for your own good, but for theirs, because they need
Yep.
to see those boundaries themselves. They need to learn those boundaries.
Mm.
I don't want to raise a son who's going to grow up and, give everything of himself to someone else and not be well in a healthy fashion. So, to my way of thinking, Chris did a good job with that part, you know, and that Trey is not the kind of boy who would ask his mother for that kind of sacrifice.
Right.
But it just kind of has to be, there had to be something there, and it had to be something pretty dark because, yeah, I mean, people or anything that preys on somebody who's in that vulnerable of a position, who's really the only person who's going to give in to something like that, right? You go across somebody, there's nothing you can offer most people that's going to make them make those kinds of sacrifices, just not anything that's worth it. And, that's exactly who you have to pinpoint. And the kind of, creature like that is looking for an open door, and
Yeah.
they don't care what causes that open door.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I wanted it to be present. I'm a huge fan of supernatural. That's always, always my big thing. I love ghosts. But I didn't want it to take this whole thing over. I wanted the story to be able to stand, without that, uh, to a degree, because it was really about Chris's internal, just everything that was going on with her and that, and what made her vulnerable to it.
Steve, you mentioned that you had some thoughts on the last page. I want to hear what your interpretation of what your thoughts were.
Well, I'm not quite sure because I thought so. I went back. I've read it over several times, and I wasn't sure how dark the ending was. So initially, my initial reaction was that this entity was pulling strings, you know, on Trey and on Chris, and Trey was trapped at the cross, and he was trying to call out to his mother when she was doing these things to not continue doing them because he was trying to get her attention and tell her not to do it. And so, but I've gone back and forth whether that's him stuck there or if he's somewhere else calling to her and not trapped because of the entity, if he's just trying to contact her another way. So I've gone back and forth with that, but I wasn't sure how dark the story was going to be. But the supernatural portions were, I liked that they were subtle and they weren't too, they were just enough to make it creepy because it left more to your imagination than it was just spoon fed to us. So that was more effective.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, I can answer the question. I never know whether I should, because it's like, does it kill the magic if I just tell you like the exact thing I was thinking for?
I'm
Go
dying to
right
know.
go right for it. Go right for it, Laurel.
He's not trapped. The entity doesn't have any hold over him, but he is unable to influence the world and contact and visit with that same level of strength.
Hmm.
He's able to make noise. He's able to, hang out at the place where his mother is going to be for that sort of interaction. But he can't just, come smack up to her like this creature does. He can't appear to her as himself in a convincing fashion. So he's kind of left with, full disclosure, I completely believe in ghosts. I have seen them, I have heard them, I've experienced them, with the caveat that I'm, fully okay with whenever I cross, whatever boundary there is, whoever meets me saying, yeah, great imagination. None of that was real. I don't know what you're talking about, but to my interpretation, the way that I believe, I feel like I've experienced those things, and I feel like the connection is on a different plane. It's in a way that makes it really hard for us to understand one another. And so to me, it would make sense that, he would, I think that the dead speak to us in dreams. I don't think necessarily that every time I dream of someone who's dead that it's them, but I do think it's one of the most effective ways they have of speaking to us.
Hmm.
So him visiting Bo and that sort of thing, because part of it is also who's open to them in that fashion. And if you think about it, if Chris is focused on this changeling thing that's not her son, then, she's closed off to what really is, because
Yeah.
that, it's not as strong of a signal, I guess. So
Hmm.
that was kind of my thought pattern on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually hadn't thought of that part because I thought it was kind of all one, like maybe the entity was reaching out to Bo and, I wasn't sure like what was going on in that section. So that's really interesting that you clarified that because now it brings another meaning for me and how I read it.
Yeah, because my thought on it is Bo wouldn't be susceptible. He's
Yeah.
kind of he would not. It's it's a little bit ironic at that point. Even though he's been the one to take those steps on, he's more open to the actual real version of his son.
Mm,
Um, and yeah, I mean that kind of plays into it just in their different way. But I thought that was something to explore too, because whether you divorce or you stay married, and I'm married happily, but how different parents, and I don't want to say necessarily that it's always fathers versus mothers, but there are just, if my mom's group on Facebook is anything to go by, there's a lot of consistencies in how mothers deal with certain things with kids and how fathers do, and the different ways that they experience those specific kinds of bonds. So and it's not a measure of who's better or whose method is better. It simply is what it is, and it affects how and have you seen What Dreams May Come, the
Mhm.
Robin Williams movie?
I have not.
No.
Okay. But won't dwell on it too much. But yeah, Steve, like the different ways the parents experience the grief. The mom just goes completely off the deep end.
Yeah.
Spoilers for a really old movie. Um, and she's furious that he won't come with her.
Mhm.
She's furious that he's still able to function. And I can definitely see that being one of those reasons why people split up after loss is, like, why are you still standing? That's,
Mhm.
what kind of person are you, kind of thing. So I
Mm,
just, I think there's a lot that people deal with in grief that is not necessarily just about the grief of the person that they've lost. There's, um, part of the thing with layering in the grief with her, and the way that it affects everything is because, and my husband he's fine, but we had a health scare a few years ago, that was just deeply frightening. My son was just a few months old, and he got a diagnosis that turned out to be not as bad as it sounded, but for like a full day, it was just like, yeah, you're probably gonna end up being a widow at a very young
oh,
age, and your kid's gonna be.
oh,
And he was in the hospital for like about a week, and I had my son by myself. I was visiting him every day, but all the little things that you think about in a situation like that, you're like, how long would it take me to stop making 8 cups of coffee and
Mhm.
then be devastated when he doesn't come out of his room and have his
yeah,
half of the pot? It's your everyday little things.
yeah,
And so, yeah, for Chris, like, I mean, when you have kids, they are, or, a spouse or whoever is part of your everyday life, your animals. I mean, God, I'm still, lost a dog and a cat in 2015, and I still, it's like, because they were my everyday.
Mhm.
yeah.
You miss them greeting you, all those kinds of things. And that's, yeah, I mean, ultimately that's also what builds up and makes Chris eminently vulnerable to this. So I feel like I keep like wandering off on these paths. So if I ever
No,
don't answer the question, please let me know. I'll,
No, it's
I
great.
will I'll redirect.
no, that's why we had you here, Laurel, so you can show us the paths. Uh, so, oh, there was something else I asked. Oh my goodness. Steve, what was your next point? I'm sorry, I wrote something down for that, but I forget. So it's your turn to talk now.
I just had something in my mind, and now it just slipped as I was we were talking. Um, I think we were talking about the supernatural portions and
Yeah.
the traumatic. Is there a way that you write, because, like I mentioned, the feeling of loss and grief was really really impactful. Is there something that you do or words that you use while you're writing to convey those feelings?
It's really a lot more of like kind of the character immersion sort of a thing. It's I hesitate to use the term like I don't know, for some reason if you say you're an empath, that there seems to be a lot of like weird negative connotation to it. But I will say that I tend to have a very high level of empathy, which is, not always a great thing, but I feel like it's one of those things, that I can tend to really lean into people's feelings when I'm speaking with them and really see their sides of things and really, I'm not saying that means and then I experience it as bad as they do, but it's more just that I'm very open to being able to see how that affects somebody, so even if
Hmm.
it's something that I haven't experienced myself, I can I can definitely see how it applies to a character. I can see how that would affect and kind of live in that head for a little while. So yeah, like I mentioned with keeping the notebook and making notes, it's like, okay, well, if you're Chris and you've lost your son and you go to like the wedding of, a friend's child, how do
Hmm.
you feel about that wedding? It's hit after hit after hit of not seeing, your child reach these milestones that you would have expected, so
Hmm.
you're grieving things that haven't even happened yet and never will. So it's that kind of thing, it's that kind of immersion into it, it's that kind of just like being willing to really let the character guide it, let them have their own full personality, and letting them just, guide their dialogue and what happens to them in those sorts of things, to just make it, just to let people experience it along with them.
Hmm. Because while I was reading this, I wondered to myself as the story was unfolding, is how far would I go if I was in her shoes? How far would I be willing to go to see my child who was killed or who was in this horrible accident, just for a few minutes, just to see him? And even if I knew somewhere deep down that it was not him, how could I not sacrifice? Why? How could I not hurt myself and have to live through losing them again? And that's part of what I think the entity was uh, was using to manipulate her. And the point you both of you brought up about the way it was, the way the language it used to manipulate her was really good. Um, because I didn't catch that on. I know that it was manipulating her, but the words that it used and the way that it did that was it's really insightful to hear both of you talk about that.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah, there's just a lot that I guess kind of goes into that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, also a lot that gets picked up on that I never, specifically thought about myself. So I don't know. It's just one of the really, I love being able to write, and I'm very lucky to have the opportunity to have people read my work and connect with it, and and offer their feedback on it and how they experienced it. And I mean, I've had people who were really didn't care for it all, because they said, they're like, well, my kid would never do this, and this is just how I experience this exactly. And I think that's worthwhile too, because it's, it I made specific choices as a writer, but sometimes that means alienating a certain sector, or it not, it just being like, okay, well, I'm this doesn't process for me, this doesn't compute. But the fact that they're willing to actually like put themselves in there and give it a try, I'm always grateful for that. And in case you haven't stumbled across me saying it before, I am a writer who welcomes all reviews. I think that reviews are for the reviewer space. That doesn't mean an author doesn't ever read them. Of course we do sometimes, but I think reviewers should be allowed to say whatever it is that they need to say in their reviews without any kind of, being bothered, or worrying that anyone's like leaning over their shoulder, like, what exactly did you
Right,
mean by that?
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
So,
Um,
oh, go ahead,
no,
Steve.
go ahead. Good. I'm sorry.
No, you go. You're the guest. You go.
Uh, I was just going to mention, and to your point that you made about, well, some of the people who have read it and said, well, my child would have never done that. I think in the book, I think Chris even mentions in the book that it's not like him to do something that that's not his personality to do that. But I kind of got the feeling that she perceived it as he was being forced to come and see her and to ask, and there were somebody was punishing him for her not going as far as
Yeah.
they wanted her to go. So I think that was part of it, was that he didn't have full control over what he was doing. So I think that's maybe, and I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but that came across to me as he didn't have full control, and that's part of the manipulation that the entity was using to manipulate her. But that's something that came across as he didn't have full control of what was happening either, for her, in her eyes anyway.
Well, and if I don't know how old your kids are, Steve, but if you've raised an adolescent, which my stepson was 10 when I met my husband, and if I tend to retain very, very clear memories of how it felt to be an adolescent, and gosh, you do turn into a different person.
Mm-hmm.
Your child does things that are, and it's not in a judgmental way at all. It's not like, you monster, but they're doing things that are so different from the child that you knew, from their personality type. It's just a different way of them becoming. It is still them, but it's a version of them. So if I feel like for Chris, when she's raised this child through adolescence, you understand that there are phases during which there's great changes that take place that you are not always privy to. And for me as a parent, it's been very important to be, to embrace those sorts of things, because I never want either of my stepson or my or Tiny, to feel, it always feels just like, or my biological, it's like, why make distinctions? But in any case, my kids, I don't want either of them to feel like the person that they're becoming or the person they're revealing to me is unwelcome. My arms are like this, they're open wide, they're for you, no matter who you are. And I feel like to Chris, that's important too. Okay. Well, you died, so you've been through something, and it's okay if there are personality changes related to that, or, and then with Lenore's presence too, to very specifically be combating and making her turn her face from the whole, my God, I sliced myself up and you're not even, happy about it. She's going to freeze herself in that thought pattern and say, no, I'm not going down that path of you must be grateful. So again, it really is kind of a perfect storm that really hoses Chris, in this situation. But yeah, the entity is bad news.
Something that I also took from that was up to this point, like obviously we're in Chris's point of view, and Chris lost her son. So, and I do think sometimes we have a tendency to glorify people who have passed away.
Oh, yeah.
And as reading it, I'm like, wow, this kid was perfect. This kid like did no wrong, and everything. And then there was a line from the grandmother that said, oh, well, he was into this, he was doing this. And that to me kind of just brought my attention to not how delusional Chris was, but how much she wasn't like in touch with that entity wasn't her son. Just like
Yeah.
it may not have been in touch with some of the behaviors when he was living. So I thought that was a really interesting point where it's a little like you see somebody that you love is so perfect and can do no wrong, and this is he's my everything, he can do no wrong. And I think that's what really fed into the entity being able to latch onto her, because she didn't question anything like that. And it kind of all goes around to like things we've already talked about. But that's a line that really stuck out to me personally, that, well, he was into this, he was into that. And it's like, you're glorifying Trey. And if you really knew Trey, he wouldn't be asking you to do this. And it changed the whole tone of the book for me at that moment, but it was something that was really valuable.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, there's those interactions are just, I mean, it goes back to the generational thing. I'm reading this really great book right now, nonfiction. It's called When the Body Says No, but it's about, I mean, it's about drawing those boundaries. It's about how ill you can make yourself by never living for yourself, by never, recognizing that just as a person, you can't give all the time. You have to be able to take or just rest or any of those kinds of things. And it's something, I had not read it at the time that I wrote this, but I think it's very common with parents in particular, because especially, when your child is very little, they depend on you for everything. And there is no, there's no interests that are just you that you can, assert over an infant. And it's something that just sort of changes as they get older, and you have to kind of, I guess, be on top of that. another 150 things you can screw up as a parent and never know until your kids reach adulthood and
Yeah.
come confront you with it. But I'll pay for the therapy. Absolutely.
Steve, do you have any last talking points that you'd like to bring up to Laurel?
There was I think it's towards the end of the book, but there was a few sentences here that really got to me. That it's funny because in a story so dark, there are some spots that are like a celebration of how wonderful being a parent is. I think is that fair to say?
Yeah.
But there's a couple of lines in here that and I have it marked on my page, but it's on page 106. But being Trey's mother had always been the scariest, most stressful, exhausting, wonderful, and perfect thing she's ever done. An answer to 1,000 prayers, and certainly worth this. I think that was really. There's little sprinkles in there of I don't want to say optimism or hope, but I think in her mind there was. But I think just in general how wonderful being a parent is, even though because it pushes us to all these different places before my son's 16 now, but when my wife was pregnant, I had friends that told me your life will never be the same, and I knew it wouldn't ever be, but there's no way for you to ever know until you experience it. So
Yeah.
and when he was born, and obviously since that day, it's just everything changes. Your life is never the same, and in wonderful in great ways, and there's also can be bad ways too. But so that really struck me as how wonderful it can be to be a parent, and obviously I have no experience being a motherhood, but it's important that we cherish mothers and motherhood and understand how wonderful that connection is, because I don't have that connection that my wife does to our kids. So I think that was important that really got to me a little bit towards the end, is her reflecting back on how wonderful it was to being a parent, and it kind of spoke to her motivations of why she was willing to go to the length she was, even though it wasn't obviously the right choice, but her mindset of why she made the choices she did.
Yeah. If there's a chance, it's
Mm.
the even knowing that it's probably wrong, but to give up everything just for the chance for your kid, for no guarantees.
Yeah.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, the no guarantees thing got me too, because I'm like,
Yeah.
oh. So Laurel, we had just have like a minute or two left. Do you want to tell the audience on how to contact you, or anything new or up and coming, anything exciting you got going on, or?
Sure. Yeah. I am. I have a contact form through my website, and I tend to answer those emails pretty quickly. It is a really out of date website though, so don't judge me too much on that. But I'm primarily on Twitter. I am on Twitter to a detrimental degree, at Hightower Laurel. And as far as stuff coming up right now, I am working on. I'm co-editing an anthology called The Dead Inside, with Dark Dispatch. Our subs closed a little less than 2 weeks ago, so I'm reading through those. It's identity horror, which has been just, man, we've got some subs that have just bled on the page and just utterly blown my mind. So I'm very excited to be putting that together. And then I've got some short stories that are coming up in a few anthologies. Diabolica Americana is going to have one from me called Iron Coffin. Woman Made by Man has one of mine called Goddess of Need. And I feel like there's probably others that I'm slightly forgetting at this juncture because I'm terrible about stuff like that. But yeah, I've got that kind of stuff going on, and I've got some bigger stuff out on submission with publishers. So fingers crossed on those fronts.
Exciting. Well, I want to thank you so much. Thank you both for being here today. This has been a lovely discussion. I really enjoyed Crossroads.
Thank
Even
you.
though it is a heavier book, I would recommend it to people who are interested in this type of thing, because it really is a great exploration of grief.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Well, I really appreciate you guys having me on and reading it. It's been awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you both again. Thank you to thank you again to all of our viewers. I really appreciate you spending your Sunday with me. And that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.